79. When I got home, Father was sitting in the kitchen, and he made my supper. He was wearing a lumberjack shirt. The supper was baked beans and broccoli and 2 slices of ham. They were laid out on a plate so that they were not touching. He said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "I have been out." This is called a white lie. A white lie is not a lie at all. It is where you tell the truth, but you do not tell all of the truth. This means that everything you say is a white lie. Because when someone says, for example, "What do you want to do today?" you say, "I want to do painting with Mrs. Peters." But you don't say, "I want to have my lunch and I want to go to the toilet and I want to go home after school and I want to play with Toby and I want to have my supper and I want to play on my computer and I want to go to bed." And I said a white lie because I knew that Father didn't want me to be a detective. Father said, "I've just had a phone call from Mrs. Shears." I started eating my baked beans and broccoli and 2 slices of ham. Then Father asked, "What the hell were you doing poking round her garden?" I said, "I was doing detective work, trying to find out who killed Wellington." Father replied, "How many times do I have to tell you, Christopher?" The baked beans and the broccoli and ham were cold, but I didn't mind this. I eat very slowly, so my food is nearly always cold. Father said, "I told you to keep your nose out of other people's business." I said, "I think Mr. Shears probably killed Wellington." Father didn't say anything. I said, "He is my prime suspect because I think someone might have killed Wellington to make Mrs. Shears sad, and a murder is usually committed by someone known." Father banged the table with his fist really hard so that the plates and his knife and fork jumped around and my ham jumped sideways so that it touched the broccoli, so I couldn't eat the ham or the broccoli anymore. Then he shouted, "I will not have that man's name mentioned in my house." I asked, "Why not?" And he said, "That man is evil." And I said, "Does that mean he might have killed Wellington?" My father put his head in his hands and he said, "Jesus wept." I could see that my father was angry with me, so I said, "I know you told me not to get involved in other people's business, but Mrs. Shears is a friend of ours." And Father said, "Well, she's not a friend anymore." And I asked, "Why not?" And Father said, "Okay, Christopher, I'm going to say this for the last and final time. I will not tell you again. Look at me when I'm talking you. For God's sake, look at me. You are not to go asking Mrs. Shears about who killed that bloody dog. You are not to go asking anybody about who killed that bloody dog. You are not to go trespassing in other people's gardens. You are to stop this ridiculous bloody detective game right now." I didn't say anything. Father said, "I'm going to make you promise, Christopher, and you know what it means when I make you promise." I did know what it meant when you say you promise something. You have to say that you will never do something again, and then you must never do it because that would make the promise a lie. I said, "I know." Father said, "Promise me you will stop doing these things. Promise that you will give up this ridiculous game right now, okay?" I said, "I promise." 83. I think I would make a very good astronaut. To be a good astronaut, you have to be intelligent, and I'm intelligent. You also have to understand how machines work, and I'm good at understanding how machines work. You also have to be someone who would like being on their own in a tiny spacecraft thousands and thousands of miles away from the surface of the Earth, and not panic or get claustrophobia or homesick or insane. And I like really little spaces, so long as there is no one else in them with me. Sometimes when I want to be on my own, I get in the airing cupboard in the bathroom and slide in beside the boiler and pull the door closed behind me and sit there and think for hours, and it makes me feel very calm. So I would have to be an astronaut on my own, or have my own part of the spacecraft which no one else could come into. And also, there are no yellow things or brown things in a spacecraft, so that would be okay too. And I would have to talk to other people from mission control, but we would do that through a radio link-up and a TV monitor, so they wouldn't be like real people who are strangers, but it would be like playing a computer game. Also, I wouldn't be homesick at all because I'd be surrounded by lots of things I like, which are machines and computers and outer space, and I would be able to look out of a little window in the spacecraft and know that there was no one else near me for thousands and thousands of miles, which is what I sometimes pretend at night in the summer when I go and lie in the lawn and look up at the sky and put my hands around the sides of my face so that I can't see the fence and the chimney and the washing line, and I can pretend I'm in space. And all I could see would be stars, and the stars are the places where the molecules that life is made of were constructed billions of years ago. For example, all the iron in your blood which stops you being anemic was made in a star. And I would like it if I could take Toby with me into space, and that might be allowed because they sometimes do take animals into space for experiments. So if I could think of a good experiment you could do with a rat that didn't hurt the rat, I could make them let me take Toby. But if they didn't let me, I would still go, because it would be a dream come true. 89. The next day at school, I told Siobhan that Father had told me I couldn't do any more detecting, which meant that the book was finished. I showed her the pages I had written so far, with the diagram of the universe and the map of the street and the prime numbers. She said that it didn't matter. She said that the book was really good as it was, and that I should be very proud of having written a book at all, even if it was quite short, and there were some very good books that were very short, like Heart of Darkness, which was by Conrad. But I said that it wasn't a proper book because it didn't have a proper ending, because I never found out who killed Wellington, so the murderer was still at large. And she said that was like life, and not all murders were solved, and not all murderers were caught, like Jack the Ripper. I said I didn't like the idea that the murderer was still at large. I said I didn't like to think that the person who killed Wellington could be living somewhere nearby, and I might meet him when I went out for a walk at night. And this was possible because a murder was usually committed by a person who was known to the victim. Then I said Father said I was never to mention Mr. Shears's name in our house again, and that he was an evil man, and maybe that meant he was the person who killed Wellington. And she said, perhaps your father just doesn't like Mr. Shears very much. And I asked, why? And she said, I don't know, Christopher. I don't know because I don't know anything about Mr. Shears. I said, Mr. Shears used to be married to Mrs. Shears and he left her, like in a divorce, but I don't know if they were actually divorced. And Siobhan said, well, Mrs. Shears is a friend of yours, isn't she? A friend of you and your father, so perhaps your father doesn't like Mr. Shears because he left Mrs. Shears because he did something bad to someone who is a friend. And I said, but Father says Mrs. Shears isn't a friend of ours any more. And Siobhan said, I'm sorry, Christopher, I wish I could answer all these questions, but I simply don't know. Then the bell went for the end of school. The next day I saw 4 yellow cars in a row on the way to school, which made it a black day, so I didn't eat anything at lunch, and I sat in the corner of the room all day and read my A-level maths course book. And the next day too, I saw 4 yellow cars in a row on the way to school, which made it another black day too, so I didn't speak to anyone, and for the whole afternoon I sat in the corner of the library groaning with my head pressed into the join between the 2 walls, and this made me feel calm and safe. But on the 3rd day I kept my eyes closed all the way to school until we got off the bus, because after I've had 2 black days in a row, I'm allowed to do that. 97. But it wasn't the end of the book, because 5 days later I saw 5 red cars in a row, which made it a super good day, and I knew that something special was going to happen. Nothing special happened at school, so I knew something special was going to happen after school. And when I got home, I went down to the shop at the end of our road to buy some licorice laces and a Milky Bar with my pocket money. And when I'd bought my licorice laces and a Milky Bar, I turned round and saw Mrs. Alexander, the old lady from number 39, who was in the shop as well. She wasn't wearing jeans now. She was wearing a dress, like a normal old lady, and she smelt of cooking. She said, "What happened to you the other day?" I asked, "Which day?" And she said, "I came out again and you'd gone. I had to eat all the biscuits myself." I said, "I went away." And she said, "I gathered that." I said, "I thought you might ring the police." And she said, Why on earth would I do that? And I said, because I was poking my nose into other people's business, and Father said I shouldn't investigate who killed Wellington, and a policeman gave me a caution, and if I get into trouble again it will be a lot worse because of the caution. Then the Indian lady behind the counter said to Mrs. Alexander, "Can I help you?" And Mrs. Alexander said she'd like a pint of milk and a packet of Jaffa cakes, and I went out of the shop. When I was outside the shop, I saw that Mrs. Alexander's Dachshund was sitting on the pavement. It was wearing a little coat made out of tartan material, which is Scottish and Czech. She had tied its lead to the drain pipe next to the door. I like dogs, so I bent down and I said hello to her dog, and it licked my hand. Its tongue was rough and wet, and it liked the smell on my trousers, and it started sniffing them. Then Mrs. Alexander came outside and said, "His name is Ivor." I didn't say anything. And Mrs. Alexander said, "You're very shy, aren't you, Christopher?" And I said, "I'm not allowed to talk to you." And she said, "Don't worry, I'm not going to tell the police, and I'm not going to tell your father, because there's nothing wrong with having a chat. Having a chat is just being friendly, isn't it?" I said, "I can't do chatting." Then she said, "Do you like computers?" And I said, "Yes, I like computers. I have a computer at home in my bedroom." And she said, "I know. I can see you sitting at your computer in your bedroom sometimes when I look across the street." Then she untied Ivor's lead from the drain pipe. Sorry about that. I wasn't going to say anything because I didn't want to get into trouble. Then I thought that this was a super good day, and something special hadn't happened yet, so it was possible that talking to Mrs. Alexander was the special thing that was going to happen, and I thought that she might tell me something about Wellington, or about Mr. Shears without me asking her, so that wouldn't be breaking my promise. So I said, "And I like maths, and looking after Toby, and also I like outer space, and I like being on my own." And she said, "I bet you're very good at maths, aren't you?" And I said, "I am. I'm going to do my A-level maths next month, and I'm going to get an A grade." And Mrs. Alexander said, "Really? A-level maths?" I replied, "Yes. I don't tell lies." And she said, "I apologise. I didn't mean to suggest that you were lying. I just wondered if I heard you correctly. I'm a little deaf sometimes." And I said, "I remember, you told me." And then I said, "I'm the first person to do an A-level from my school because it's a special school." And she said, "Well, I'm very impressed, and I hope you do get an A." And I said, "I will." Then she said, "And the other thing I know about you is that your favourite colour is not yellow." And I said, "No, and it's not brown either. My favourite colour is red, and metal colour." Then Ivor did a poo, and Mrs. Alexander picked it up with her hand inside a little plastic bag, and then she turned the plastic bag inside out and tied a knot at the top so that the poo was all sealed up and she didn't touch the poo with her hands. And then I did some reasoning. I reasoned that Father had only made me do a promise about 5 things, which were: 1. Not to mention Mr. Shears's name in our house. 2. Not to go asking Mrs. Shears about who killed that bloody dog. 3. Not to go asking anyone about who killed that bloody dog. 4. Not to go trespassing in other people's gardens. 5. To stop this ridiculous bloody detective game. And asking about Mr. Shears wasn't any of these things. And if you are a detective, you have to take risks, and this was a super good day, which meant that it was a good day for taking risks. So I said, "Do you know Mr. Shears?" which was like chatting. And Mrs. Alexander said, "Not really, no. I mean, I knew him well enough to say hello and talk to a little in the street, but I didn't know much about him. I think he worked in a bank, the National Westminster in town." And I said, "Father says that he's an evil man. Do you know why he said that? Is Mr. Shears an evil man?" And Mrs. Alexander said, "Why are you asking me about Mr. Shears, Christopher?" I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be investigating Wellington's murder, and that was the reason I was asking about Mr. Shears. But Mrs. Alexander said, "Is this about Wellington?" And I nodded because that didn't count as being a detective. Mrs. Alexander didn't say anything. She walked to the little red box on a pole next to the gate to the park, and she put Ivor's poo into the box, which was a brown thing inside a red thing, which made my head feel funny, so I didn't look. Then she walked back to me. She sucked in a big breath and said, "Perhaps it would be best not to talk about these things, Christopher." And I asked, "Why not?" And she said, "Because." And she stopped and decided to start saying a different sentence. "Because maybe your father is right, and you shouldn't go around asking questions about this." And I asked, "Why?" And she said, "Because obviously he's going to find it quite upsetting." And I said, "Why is he going to find it upsetting?" Then she sucked in another big breath and said, Because I think you know why your father doesn't like Mr. Shears very much." Then I asked, "Did Mr. Shears kill Mother?" And Mrs. Alexander said, "Kill her?" And I said, "Yes. Did he kill Mother?" And Mrs. Alexander said, No, of course he didn't kill your mother." And I said, "But did he give her stress so that she died of a heart attack?" And Mrs. Alexander said, "I honestly don't know what you're talking about, Christopher." And I said, "Or did he hurt her so that she had to go into hospital?" And Mrs. Alexander said, "Did she have to go into hospital?" And I said, "Yes, and it wasn't very serious at first, but she had a heart attack when she was in hospital." And Mrs. Alexander said, "Oh my goodness." And I said, "And she died?" And Mrs. Alexander said, "Oh my goodness," again. And then she said, "Oh, Christopher, I am so sorry, I never realised." Then I asked her, "Why did you say, 'I think you know why your father doesn't like Mr. Shears very much'?" Mrs. Alexander put her hand over her mouth and said, "Oh dear, but she didn't answer my question. So I asked her the same question again, because in a murder mystery novel, when someone doesn't want to answer a question, it is because they're trying to keep a secret or trying to stop someone getting into trouble, which means that the answers to those questions are the most important answers of all, and that is why the detective has to put that person under pressure." But Mrs. Alexander still didn't answer. Instead, she asked me a question. She said, "So you don't know?" And I said, "Don't know what?" She replied, "Christopher, look, I probably shouldn't be telling you this." Then she said, "Perhaps we should take a little walk in the park together. This is not the place to be talking about this kind of thing." I was nervous. I did not know Mrs. Alexander. I knew that she was an old lady and that she liked dogs, but she was a stranger, and I never go to the park on my own because it's dangerous and people inject drugs behind the public toilets in the corner. I wanted to go home and go up to my room and feed Toby and practice some maths. But I was excited too, because I thought she might tell me a secret, and the secret might be about who killed Wellington, or about Mr. Shears, and if she did that, I might have more evidence against him, or be able to exclude him from my investigations. So because it was a super good day, I decided to walk into the park with Mrs. Alexander, even though it scared me. When we were inside the park, Mrs. Alexander stopped walking and said, "I'm going to say something to you, and you must promise not to tell your father that I told you this." I asked why, and she said, "I shouldn't have said what I said, and if I don't explain, you'll carry on wondering what I meant, and you might ask your father, and I don't want you to do that, because I don't want you to upset him. So I'm going to explain why I said what I said. But before I do that, you have to promise not to tell anyone I said this to you." I asked, "Why?" And she said, "Christopher, please, just trust me." And I said, "I promise, because if Mrs. Alexander told me who killed Wellington, or she told me that Mr. Shears had really killed Mother, I could still go to the police and tell them, because you're allowed to break a promise if someone has committed a crime and you know about it." And Mrs. Alexander said, "Your mother, before she died, was very good friends with Mr. Shears." And I said, "I know." And she said, "No, Christopher, I'm not sure that you do. I mean, they were very good friends. Very, very good friends." I thought about this for a while and said, "Do you mean that they were doing sex?" And Mrs. Alexander said, "Yes, Christopher, that's what I mean." Then she didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Christopher. I really didn't mean to say anything that was going to upset you. But I wanted to explain why I said what I said. You see, I thought you knew. That's why your father thinks that Mr. Shears is an evil man, and that will be why he doesn't want you to go around talking to people about Mr. Shears, because that will bring back bad memories." And I said, "Was that why Mr. Shears left Mrs. Shears, because he was doing sex with someone else when he was married to Mrs. Shears?" And Mrs. Alexander said, "Yes, I expect so." Then she said, "I'm sorry, Christopher. I really am." And I said, "I think I should go now." And she said, "Are you okay, Christopher?" And I said, "I'm scared of being in the park with you because you're a stranger." And she said, "I'm not a stranger, Christopher. I'm a friend." And I said, "I'm going home now." And she said, "If you want to talk about this, you can come and see me any time you want. You only have to knock on my door." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "Christopher." And I said, "What?" And she said, "You won't tell your father about this conversation, will you?" And I said, "No, I promised." And she said, "You go on home and remember what I said, any time." Then I went home. So that's today's reading. Hope you enjoyed it.